Research Station Verdant 7 occupied a cleared plateau on Kesith 9. Like a chess piece on a board, it didn't understand. The station itself was regulation compliant in every tedious particular, modular habitat sections arranged in the approved hexagonal configuration, atmospheric processors humming at precisely calibrated intervals, solar arrays tilted to optimal angles for a star that Kesith 9 orbited with peculiar elliptical enthusiasm. Around this monument to institutional architecture, the jungle pressed close with the patience of something that had outlasted meteor impacts and ice ages, and would certainly outlast prefabricated research modules. The station housed 7 researchers representing 4 species, which sounded diplomatically diverse until one considered they were trying not to starve together. The crisis had arrived with characteristic bureaucratic understatement. A message from the logistics coordinator, a kiln named Torvanesh, who existed somewhere in the administrative apparatus like a particularly officious deity, had appeared in the station's communication queue with a subject line reading Supply Shuttle Revision Notice. Inside, buried in 3 paragraphs of apologetic jargon about solar weather patterns and transit window optimization, lived the relevant fact: the next supply delivery would be delayed by a minimum of 3 months, possibly 4, conceivably 5, depending on stellar atmospheric cooperation. The station's senior researcher, a kiln named Pimresh, had read this message aloud during the weekly coordination meeting with the slow, careful enunciation of someone translating a death sentence from bureaucrats into mortality. 3 months, Pimresh repeated, her chromatic scales shifting through a sequence that in kiln body language indicated deep administrative concern. Our current reserves were calculated for standard rotation intervals with the customary 7% surplus buffer, which means, asked Brulon, one of the 2 Threxy researchers. Threxy were compact, efficient creatures who approached most problems with the same energy conservation instincts that governed their homeworld's scarce resource economy. Which means, said Cosima Wren, the station's sole human representative, we're going to run out of food approximately 6 weeks before the earliest possible resupply. The meeting had deteriorated predictably from there. The other kiln researchers, Devresh and Kimrol, had immediately begun proposing rationing schedules with the mathematical precision their species brought to every logistical challenge. The Threxy had countered with hibernation rotation proposals that would reduce total caloric demand. Nilsson, the Pavrit researcher whose species consumed nutrition through sophisticated filtration rather than conventional eating, had quietly calculated how many times he could recycle his nutrient suspension before it degraded below survivable concentration. Everyone had solutions. All the solutions involved gradually weakening until rescue arrived, hoping their particular biology could stretch misery across enough weeks. Cosima had listened to 2 hours of this before excusing herself to check on her canopy symbiosis research. No one had noticed she'd taken the portable bioscanner and several sample collection bags with her. The thing about multi-species research stations, Cosima had learned during her first year on Kesith 9, was that they functioned as small-scale demonstrations of how different civilizations approached the concept of place. The kiln viewed environments as systems to be documented and understood through comprehensive cataloging. They had spent 3 years creating the most elaborate botanical database of Kesith 9's plateau region that would likely ever exist. The Threxy saw ecosystems as resource networks to be mapped for efficiency and sustainability. Nilsson, whose Pavrit ancestors had evolved in tidal zones filtering micronutrients from ocean currents, treated the jungle as a fascinating chemical soup that occasionally produced interesting precipitation. Humans, Cosima had noticed, seemed to view new environments as problems that might contain solutions if you poked at them long enough. The emergency committee, Because of course the kiln had immediately formed an emergency committee, met daily to review rationing protocols and calculate declining nutrition curves. Cosima attended the first week of meetings, then started missing them. She had explained, when Pimresh inquired with pointed concern, that her research schedule required extended field observation during the current growth cycle. This was technically true. Cosima was observing the jungle very carefully. She simply wasn't observing it for her original research purposes. Kesith 9's plateau jungle was abundant in the way that functional ecosystems tended to be, matter and energy cycling through trophic levels with the mindless efficiency of physics. Shelf fungi grew in spectacular spiral formations on the ancient bark analog of the plateau's dominant tree equivalents, some specimens reaching 3 meters in diameter. Tuberous root structures from canopy vines hung in dense curtains, their surface patterns suggesting internal cellular architecture that Davrish had documented across 47 distinct morphological varieties. The ground itself supported a carpet of photosynthetic moss that ranged in color from deep violet to pale amber depending on light exposure and seasonal moisture. None of this was food. The station's comprehensive surveys had classified it all as xenobiological specimens of research interest, noted chemical compositions that differed from Earth-standard biochemistry, and filed everything under environmental context for primary research objectives. Cosima, standing knee-deep in violet moss with her scanner and a collection bag, was reconsidering that classification system. The portable bioscanner could analyze chemical structures and flag potentially toxic compounds based on known biological incompatibilities. It was designed to prevent researchers from accidentally poisoning themselves during field work. Cosima had discovered it could also, with creative interpretation, suggest which local organisms contained compounds that human biochemistry might theoretically process. Theoretically was doing considerable work in that assessment. She started with the shelf fungi because they at least looked like something Earth biology had produced analogues for. The scanner indicated complex carbohydrate chains, protein-like structures that weren't quite proteins, and a concerning concentration of compounds that resembled alkaloids. The smallest specimen she could find still weighed nearly 2 kilograms. Cosima cut a sample the size of her thumb, brought it back to her private quarters, and subjected it to every non-destructive analysis the station's limited equipment allowed. Then she cooked a portion roughly the size of a coin on a portable heating element and ate it. The taste was interesting in the way that industrial solvents were interesting. Her stomach cramped for an hour, then settled. She didn't vomit, which she logged as qualified success. She also didn't gain any nutritional value, which she logged as predictable failure. The second attempt involved soaking the fungus sample in water for 6 hours, discarding the water, then cooking it. The result was marginally less toxic and substantially more bland. The third attempt added a 12-hour soak, 2 water changes, and longer cooking time. Cosima ate a piece the size of her palm and waited. Her digestive system, bless its opportunistic human resilience, accepted the offering without complaint. She marked the shelf fungus as potentially viable after extended processing and moved on to the tubers. Week 3 of the crisis found the station operating under strict rationing protocols. The kiln had created a schedule of such elaborate precision that each researcher knew exactly which portion of which ration bar they would consume at which hour for the next 73 days. The mathematics were impeccable. The underlying assumption that they would all slowly weaken in perfect proportion until rescue arrived or they didn't remained unquestioned. Cosima had lost approximately 4 kilograms, which she knew because the station's health monitoring recorded mass as part of standard safety protocols. She hadn't reduced her rations, she'd simply been eating samples of variously processed jungle matter and occasionally experiencing digestive consequences. The tubers, after processing, were almost nutritious. The moss, when dried and powdered, could be consumed without immediate harm, though it tasted like licking a battery. Certain seed pods contained oils that the scanner suggested included fatty acid analogues, though extracting them required more equipment than Cosima's quarters provided. She had created a document. It was titled Preliminary Assessment of Local Organism Edibility for Human Standard Biology, and it contained 47 pages of meticulously logged failures, 12 pages of qualified successes, and 3 pages of combinations that had produced something resembling actual food. Cosima saved the document to the shared research database and sent a message to everyone on the station: common area tonight, 1900 hours. Bring your appetites and your analytical skepticism. Then she went to prepare something that might charitably be called a meal. The common area of Research Station Verdant 7 served as dining facility, meeting space and social center with the multi-purpose efficiency that institutional design favored. Cosima had cleared one of the tables and arranged 7 plates with the careful attention to presentation that turned eating into dining. Each plate held 3 components. The first was processed shelf fungus that she'd soaked, cooked, and seasoned with the limited flavor compounds available in the station's supplies. The result looked almost like roasted mushroom and had a texture that wouldn't horrify anyone familiar with Earth cuisine. The second was a paste made from vine tubers that had been ground, leached through multiple water changes to remove irritating compounds, then cooked into something spreadable. The third was a small portion of moss that had been dried, heated until its most unpleasant chemical components broke down, and mixed with fungus extract to create something that could generously be described as having flavor. It looked like food. That alone was somewhat shocking to researchers who'd been consuming nutrition bars measured to the gram. They arrived at 1900 hours precisely because multi-species research stations ran on punctuality. Pimresh entered first, her chromatic scales shifting through colors that suggested administrative confusion. The other kiln followed, then the Threxy, then Nilsson, who technically didn't need to attend but had come anyway out of what Cosima suspected was pure curiosity. "Please sit," Cosima said, gesturing to the plates. "This is," Kimrel began, then seemed to lose the sentence somewhere between observation and classification. "Food," Cosima finished. "Possibly. I've been running experiments." "We noticed you've been absent from committee meetings," Pimresh said with the careful neutrality of someone avoiding accusation, "and that you've lost mass according to health monitoring systems. I've been eating samples of local organisms," Cosima explained. "These plates represent the combinations I've found to be both non-toxic and potentially nutritious for human biology." The silence that followed had weight. "You've been consuming unclassified xenobiological specimens," Davresh said slowly, his scales rippling with something between horror and fascination. "That violates approximately 47 different research protocols. I've consumed specimens that your research has comprehensively classified," Cosima corrected. "I just approached the classification with different questions. Your surveys documented chemical composition. I wanted to know if those chemicals would kill me, and if they wouldn't, whether they'd feed me." "And?" Brulon asked, leaning forward with the Threxy's characteristic directness. "They didn't kill me. Some of them appear to be feeding me, though I'd need several more weeks to confirm nutritional adequacy." Cosima gestured to the plates again. This is everything I've learned so far. The shelf fungus needs extended soaking and cooking to break down alkaloid compounds into something digestible. The tubers contain irritants that water leaching removes. The moss is mostly inert but provides bulk and trace minerals. Nilsson's filtering tendrils twitched in the pattern that indicated deep thought. You've created processing methods. I've adapted techniques humans developed over thousands of years to make poisonous plants edible. Acorn leaching, cassava processing, mushroom identification. My species has a long history of looking at things that might kill us and asking how to make them into dinner instead. This is extraordinary, said Trenner, the second Threxy researcher, who'd been silent until now, and entirely useless to us. Your biology is not our biology. No, Cosima agreed, but my methods might be. I've documented everything, which compounds break down with heat, which wash away with water, which concentrate or disperse with different processing. I've created a framework. Whether it works for your digestive systems, I have no idea. That's the experiment I'm proposing. Pimresh looked at the plate in front of her with an expression that suggested administrative protocols had not prepared her for this scenario. You're asking us to consume potentially toxic organisms based on your personal experimentation. I'm asking you to consider that this planet has been feeding its own ecosystem quite successfully for millions of years, and we might be able to negotiate entry into that system instead of just waiting to see if we starve before the supply shuttle arrives. Cosima picked up the plate in front of her own seat. I'll eat first. You can watch and see if I survive the next hour. Then you can decide. She ate. The food was not delicious. The fungus had an earthy blandness. The tuber paste was starchy and needed salt. The station didn't have. The moss added texture without flavor, but it was recognizably food, the product of cultivation and preparation rather than industrial nutrition engineering. The researchers watched her with the intensity of people observing a potentially lethal scientific demonstration. 30 minutes passed. Cosima did not collapse, vomit, or show signs of toxic reaction. She simply sat, digesting, while 7 researchers contemplated the plates in front of them and the larger question those plates represented. Your research logs, Pimresh said finally. You've documented all processing methods. Obsessively, 47 pages of failures, 12 of qualified successes, 3 of actual food, all with chemical analysis and preparation notes. Then, Pimresh's scales shifted through a color sequence that took several seconds to complete. Then we should begin systematic testing for cross-species compatibility, using proper scientific methodology. Obviously, said Davresh, though his voice carried a tone that suggested nothing about this situation was obvious. We'll need to establish testing protocols, safety parameters, baseline chemical analysis for each species' digestive capabilities. We'll need to start tomorrow, Brulon interrupted. Because our rations are still declining and talking about protocols doesn't change that. Nilsson extended a filtering tendril toward the plate in front of him, then retracted it. I cannot consume solid matter. But if these organisms can be broken down into chemical suspension, the moss might work, Cosima said. High surface area, breaks down in water. If you could filter the resulting suspension, I could attempt processing, Nilsson said thoughtfully. It would require experimentation. Welcome to the program, Cosima said. Research Station Verdant 7 transformed over the following weeks in ways that would have baffled any logistics coordinator reviewing their activity reports. The station's purpose had been xenobotanical research, documenting Kesith 9's plateau ecosystem with scientific rigor. That purpose didn't change exactly. It simply acquired urgency and a much more personal dimension. The kiln approached the problem with their species' characteristic systematic thoroughness. Pimresh created a testing matrix that would have satisfied any review board, documenting which local organisms each kiln researcher would attempt, in what quantities, with what processing methods, and with what monitoring protocols. They started with Cosima's shelf fungus because it had the most comprehensive documentation. The first attempt made Kimro violently ill, which the kiln logged with scientific detachment despite the physical misery involved. The second attempt, using a longer soaking period, produced digestive discomfort but no vomiting. The third attempt, with an additional processing step that involved heating the soaking water before discarding it, proved tolerably digestible. The heat denatures something, Kimrol explained during the daily research meeting that had replaced the daily rationing meeting. Some protein analog structure that kiln digestive enzymes can't break down. Once it's denatured, we can process it. You're cooking it twice, Cosima said. Once in the soaking water, once for eating. Apparently your species discovered this independently with various toxic plants, Davrish added, because he'd spent the previous evening reading everything he could find in the station's database about human food processing history. Acorns, certain beans, cassava root, all require extensive processing to remove toxins. Humans will eat anything if you cook it enough times. Cosima agreed. The Threxy took a different approach. Rulon and Trenna began hunting the small arthropod equivalents that inhabited the jungle's lower canopy, creatures that the station's surveys had documented but never considered as potential resources. The things were approximately the size of a human thumb, with exoskeletons that contained protein analogues and fat deposits that analysis suggested might be metabolically useful. The key is preparation, Trenna explained, demonstrating her technique. Raw, they contain compounds that interfere with Threxy digestion. But if you remove the digestive tract, cook them thoroughly, the result is actually quite nutritious. They taste like the concept of protein without any of the pleasure, Rulon added. But they're abundant, easy to catch, and they appear to actually feed us. Survival food, Cosima said. Survival food, Rulon agreed with satisfaction. Nilsson's experiments were more abstract, but no less important. He'd discovered that certain mosses, when thoroughly dried and then rehydrated in water, released compounds his filtering system could process. The nutritional value was marginal, but marginal was substantially better than the steadily degrading suspension he'd been recycling. I can supplement, he explained, his filtering tendrils moving in patterns of cautious optimism. Not replace my standard nutrition entirely, but extend it. Perhaps indefinitely if I can cultivate certain moss varieties in controlled conditions. We have planter modules in storage, Pimresh noted. For experimental cultivation, they've never been used. They're about to be, Nilsson said. The work developed its own rhythm. Mornings involved foraging expeditions, carefully planned routes through the jungle, multiple species working together to identify and harvest target organisms. The kiln's comprehensive surveys became practical guides instead of academic documentation. Devresh, who'd spent 2 years cataloging fungal distribution patterns, now led expeditions to optimal harvesting sites. Kimrol's root structure maps became foraging guides. Afternoons were for processing. The station's common area transformed into something between laboratory and kitchen, various species working at different stations with their specific requirements. The kiln had claimed one entire table for their elaborate soaking and heating procedures. The Threxy had established an efficient butchering operation for their arthropod harvest. Nilsson had created a drying rack system for moss cultivation. Cosima moved between stations, consulting, suggesting adapting techniques that worked for one species' biology to another's requirements. "You're teaching us to forage," Pimresh observed one afternoon, watching Cosima demonstrate a new fungus processing technique. "I'm teaching you to observe," Cosima corrected. "Foraging is just applied observation. You look at what's available, you test it carefully, you learn what works. Your species already knows how to observe. You've created 3 years of impeccable documentation. I'm just suggesting you observe with different questions. Questions about hunger," Pimresh said. "Questions about participation," Cosima said. "You've been studying Kesith 9's ecosystem from outside it. Now you're asking how to live inside it. That's a different kind of research." The daily research meetings evolved into collaborative problem-solving sessions. Someone would report a new finding: a seed pod with promising oil content, a tuber variety that processed more easily, a particularly abundant arthropod colony, and the group would discuss processing methods, sustainability considerations, nutritional analysis. The kiln brought their systematic documentation. The Threxy contributed efficiency optimization. Nilsson offered chemical insights. Cosima provided her catalogue of processing techniques adapted from human history and personal experimentation. Week 8 found them not merely surviving but developing preferences. Kimroll had discovered that certain shelf fungus varieties, when processed with his 3-stage method, had distinctly different flavors. The Threxy had begun selective harvesting, taking only mature arthropods and leaving juveniles to reproduce. Nilsson's moss cultivation experiments had produced 3 viable varieties that supplemented his nutrition with different trace compounds. Cosima had moved beyond survival food into actual cooking. She'd found that combining processed tubers with fungus and certain seed oils created something that had actual flavor complexity. It wasn't delicious by Earth standards, but it was recognizably cuisine rather than mere calories. "You're enjoying this," Trenner observed one evening, watching Cosima prepare the communal meal that had become routine. "I'm eating food I made from ingredients I found in a place I'm learning to understand," Cosima said. "Yes, I'm enjoying it." "Aren't you?" Trenner considered this. "I've eaten efficiency rations my entire adult life. Nutritionally optimized, perfectly consistent, requiring no preparation. This," she gestured to the arthropods she'd been processing, "requires effort, attention, learning. It's inefficient, and it's interesting," Trenner admitted. "I know these creatures now, their behavior, their ecology, their role in the nutrient cycle. I've learned more about Kesith 9's arthropod population in 8 weeks than I learned in 2 years of survey work. Because now I'm paying attention with purpose beyond documentation." "Welcome to the relationship between humans and food," Cosima said. "We've been paying attention with purpose for about 10,000 years. The supply shuttle arrived on week 19, approximately 3 weeks later than the most pessimistic estimate. Its crew found Research Station Verdant 7 in full operation, researchers healthy and active, and the emergency they'd expected to find conspicuously absent. The shuttle commander, a kill named Vorshen, who'd made this supply run 14 times and expected routine, stood in the common area staring at tables covered in unfamiliar food processing equipment and several drying racks of cultivated moss. "Your emergency provisions," Vorshen said slowly, "were calculated to last 15 weeks maximum with strict rationing. You've survived 19 weeks. How? We adapted our nutrition sourcing," Pimresh explained, with the careful phrasing of someone describing something that sounded absurd in summary. using local organisms processed for cross-species digestive compatibility. You've been eating the native ecosystem, Vorshen said flatly. We've been participating in the native ecosystem, Davresh corrected. Through carefully researched and systematically tested methodology that builds on existing survey data combined with processing techniques adapted from human agricultural history. Vorshen looked at the supply containers his crew was unloading. You realize we've brought 19 weeks of emergency rations, which we appreciate, Pimresh said. They'll make excellent backup reserves. Backup reserves, Vorshen repeated. For the food you're harvesting from the jungle, correct. The debrief took 3 hours. The shuttle crew wanted to understand what had happened, which was reasonable. The station researchers tried to explain, which was challenging because the explanation required describing a shift in perspective that didn't translate easily into logistics reports. The humans started it, Kimrol said at one point, which was both accurate and entirely insufficient. Vorshen turned to Cosima. You developed the processing methods. I adapted existing human techniques to local organisms, Cosima said. But everyone here developed the species-specific applications. I just asked the first question, which was, can we eat this planet, and if not immediately, what would it take to make it edible? Cosima shrugged. Humans have been asking that question about every environment we've encountered for our entire evolutionary history. It seemed relevant. Other species don't think this way, Vorshen said. It wasn't quite an accusation. Other species have different relationships with their environments, Cosima agreed. Humans have historically been very creative about turning places that didn't want to feed us into places that would. It's made us simultaneously adaptable and somewhat concerning to civilizations that prefer stability. Brulon laughed, which translated through Thrixie vocalization as a sound like gravel sliding downhill. She taught us to be concerning. She taught you to forage, Vorshen corrected. Same thing, Brulon said. The supply shuttle departed 6 hours later, carrying the station's regular data reports and a new addendum that Vorshen filed under irregular resource adaptation protocols. The station's official logs would record the incident as a successful response to supply chain disruption through innovative local resource utilization, which was bureaucratically accurate and entirely missed the point. 3 weeks after the shuttle's departure, Research Station Verdant 7 continued operations with minimal use of the emergency rations now stored in climate-controlled containers. The researchers maintained their adapted routines, morning foraging expeditions, afternoon processing, evening meals that had evolved into something approaching culinary tradition. Pimresh had submitted a research proposal to the coordinating institution, suggesting expanded investigation into sustainable resource utilization across multi-species research stations. Davresh and Kimrol were co-authoring a paper on processing methodologies for xenobiological organisms. The Thrixie had begun detailed population studies of their primary arthropod analog food source to ensure harvesting sustainability. Nilsum's moss cultivation had expanded to 6 varieties, each providing different nutritional supplementation. Cosima had returned to her original canopy symbiosis research, though she still maintained the processing equipment and continued experimenting with new food combinations. She'd recently discovered that certain tree resin compounds, when properly prepared, created something approximating syrup. The applications were limited, but the principle was satisfying. The evening meal had become ritual, all 7 researchers gathering to share food they'd collectively found, processed, and prepared. The kiln ate their multiply-soaked and carefully heated fungi. The Thrixie consumed their arthropod harvest. Nilsson filtered his cultivated moss suspension. Cosima ate combinations of tuber, fungus, seed oil, and occasional tree resin that approached actual cuisine. Next week's foraging plan, Pimresh said, because even adapted routines required kiln organizational structure. Kimrol has identified a new root tuber variant in the Eastern Plateau section. Brulon wants to investigate arthropod populations near the water processor outflow. Nilsson requires samples from the northern moss beds. Cosima has requested, what did you request? Permission to try making bread, Cosima said. I think I can process certain seed pods into something flour adjacent. It'll take experimentation. Everything takes experimentation, Davrish said, which from a kiln represented remarkable philosophical adaptation. Everything interesting, Cosima agreed. Outside Research Station Verdant 7, Kesith 9's jungle continued its patient existence, indifferent to the small drama of temporary inhabitants learning to read its abundance. The shelf fungi spiraled upward according to growth patterns established before any of the current researchers' species had developed agriculture. The arthropod analogues followed reproductive cycles calibrated to seasonal variations that predated institutional research protocols. The moss grew, the tubers dangled, the seeds developed according to logic that cared nothing for multi-species dietary requirements. None of it had changed. The jungle remained exactly what it had always been, a functional ecosystem cycling matter and energy through trophic levels with the mindless efficiency of physics. What had changed was 7 researchers' relationship to hunger, to place, to the question of what constituted food. They'd stopped treating sustenance as something delivered on scheduled shuttles, and started treating it as something negotiated with their environment through observation, experimentation, and patience. They'd learned to pay attention with purpose, to ask questions with their hands in the dirt, to understand that edible was a matter of process rather than intrinsic property. In the station's climate-controlled storage, 19 weeks of emergency rations sat in perfect preservation, a monument to the idea that food was something provided by external systems rather than something made through engagement with immediate ecology. The rations waited, carefully packaged and nutritionally optimized, slowly accumulating dust. The jungle outside, abundant and alien and utterly indifferent, continued feeding 7 researchers who'd learned to ask it questions in languages older than logistics coordination and more fundamental than institutional protocols. The questions were simple ones. What grows here? How does it work? Can we participate? And if we pay attention long enough, will this place consent to feed us? Kesith 9's ecosystem, being an ecosystem and therefore operating without consent or opinion, simply continued existing. The researchers, having learned to exist alongside it rather than in opposition to it, took this as answer enough. They ate, they studied, they cultivated, they turned observation into relationship and hunger into conversation. Somewhere in the administrative apparatus of the Xenobotanical Research Coordination Bureaucracy, Torvinesh, the logistics coordinator, would eventually receive reports about Resource Station Verdant 7's irregular adaptation protocols and wonder what had actually happened during those 19 weeks. The reports would be filed, analyzed, and possibly incorporated into future supply disruption contingency planning. But the reports, however comprehensive, would miss the essential transformation. They would document methods and outcomes without capturing the moment when 7 researchers stopped waiting to be fed and started learning to feed themselves. That moment couldn't be compressed into logistics data because it wasn't about food, not really. It was about the difference between studying a place and living in it, between cataloging resources and becoming resourceful, between surviving on what you brought and thriving on what you found. The human had asked the first question. The jungle, being a jungle, had answered with the same patient abundance. It offered everything that learned to speak its chemical languages. And 7 researchers, representing 4 species with entirely different relationships to sustenance and survival, had discovered that the gap between starving and eating was sometimes just a matter of asking better questions and paying attention to the answers that grew all around them, waiting to be recognized as food.